and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. This morning, U.S. Senator Roger Wicker joins us, and we'll discuss Hurricane Ida's aftermath, the need for hard infrastructure, COVID-19, and more with Mississippi Senator Roger Wicker. And we'll look at fresh reporting on the rental crisis impacting the American South, and black people in particular. Jackson, Mississippi has one of the nation's highest eviction rates, and as writer Rebekah Barber tells us, renters now have a lot less protection from eviction. But first, Mississippi Republican Senator Roger Wicker sits on the U.S. Senate committees on armed services, on commerce, science, and transportation, on environment and public works, and much more. He joins us this week for a frank discussion not long after Hurricane Ida tore a path of destruction from the Gulf Coast to the Atlantic seaboard. Talking to Senator Wicker this morning, and let's talk a little bit about infrastructure. We had your fellow Congressman Republican last week, Congressman Michael Guest, who says he doesn't support the $1.2 trillion infrastructure package making its way to the House, but the Senate's already passed that initiative that you are in favor of. Explain why you supported that.
Well, I supported it because we need infrastructure in the United States. We need highways, roads, bridges, Lord knows we need water infrastructure in big cities like Jackson, and also smaller towns and communities around the state. This is an infrastructure proposal that we do every 5 years. This time we made it twice as big. It's usually $500 million. This is more like $1 trillion because we have so many needs. It doesn't involve a tax increase. It's fully offset in the budget, so there's no addition to the deficit. And it will give our states and our local governments an opportunity to do things like replace the 1,200 bridges in Mississippi that have been rated in poor condition, the 6,000 or so miles of highways in Mississippi. There's highways that are rated in poor condition. And that is writ large in all of our 50 states. Our infrastructure has gotten behind. We've neglected it. We had to shut down a bridge, an interstate bridge across the Mississippi River in Memphis, Tennessee, but because of a crack in one of the relatively young bridges there. So their infrastructure needs highways failing, bridges being closed all over the nation, as well as broadband. There's money in this bill for broadband, for flood control, and we need that here in Jackson. We need it in the Delta and other places. Ports and safe drinking water, things of that nature. There's a lot of hard asset infrastructure in this bill that'll be spent over a 5-year period, and it's paid for in no tax increase.
You spoke recently about the federal spending on hard infrastructure paying off in the weather emergency we just saw with Hurricane Ida. Talk about that and what you observed in the storm and the aftermath.
Well, true. For example, in New Orleans, Katrina was a major disaster. Actually, we know in Mississippi that the force of the wind and waves hit Mississippi, and that is what caused the devastation in Mississippi. But in New Orleans, it was the flood control, it was the walls and flood protection that didn't work. It actually worked this time. Now, we had power outages all over South Mississippi and in New Orleans, and they're still fixing that. Unlike Katrina, where the flood control walls actually didn't hold, they worked this time. The walls held, the flood didn't come into this low-lying area of New Orleans, and also the pumps worked. We need a pump in the Mississippi Delta to do the same sort of thing when the floodwaters get high. Speaking
of the pump, you think it's likely we'll get the pumps in the Delta?
Well, I think we have a better chance than we have in a couple of decades. The EPA has signed off on it, and now the money's got to be appropriated, and we also be working in connection with the Corps of Engineers. So it's two federal agencies that are very much involved in that project. But we need to understand exactly what that does. We have a flood control gate near Vicksburg that keeps the water from backing up from the Mississippi River into the Delta. Oftentimes, it rains above that flood control barrier and a bathtub effect occurs there. And we just want to be able to pump the water out at a certain elevation so the farmers, the homeowners, the businesses, and the residents in that area can have certainty of where the flood might happen and where it will end by starting to pump the water at a certain elevation above sea level. That's all we want to do there, and I think it's closer to being done than ever before. And we do that all up and down the Mississippi River. The last pump to be approved is ours in Mississippi, and it's been decades that we've been trying that. But yes, pumps are used. The same principle in Arkansas, up and down the river, in Louisiana, and certainly in New Orleans.
A few days after Ida hit the Gulf Coast, remnants of the system were partly to blame for dumping huge amounts of water and rain on the northeastern part of the country, causing massive flooding. The overwhelming bulk of scientific opinion suggests that we are going to see more extreme weather, more dangerous storms in the years and decades to come. What does the federal government need to do right now in terms of bolstering our storm protection systems and emergency response systems across the country?
You have hit on the correct response, and that is to harden our flood control and protection efforts. And I'll give you an example. In South Mississippi, when houses were washed away after Katrina, they've been rebuilt according to flood control and hurricane control standards. They're up higher, they're more resilient, and they withstand storms now. Seawalls are going to have to be strengthened in areas where we think the sea level is going to rise and where there have been storms. So hardening of assets is part of what we need to do, and I think that's the best approach.
You were fully vaccinated with the vaccine, but you got COVID.
Yes.
How are you doing? And
thank you. Thank you for asking. I'm fine. I think I'm one of the breakthrough cases. I was vaccinated, and then here came this Delta variant. But I think I had a mild case because I was vaccinated. And then I recommend the antibody infusion, which I was able to get. It's a drip, like a transfusion. That takes about 25 minutes. So I had a couple of bad days and nights. And after that, I felt like I was getting over a cold. It can be tragic, and it can cause death. But I have really not heard of any cases, to my knowledge, very few cases where people had to be hospitalized if they had had the vaccine. So I really recommend that my friends and neighbors and all of our citizens in Mississippi get the vaccine.
Why do you think there's so much resistance to getting the vaccine? Particularly here in Mississippi, where our vaccination rates are low.
There have been a number of opinions. We do sort of have a skepticism around here, but I think at this point, with the vaccine having been widely used since December, so we're up on 9 months now. I think the science and just the experience of our neighbors like me, who had a mild case because I was vaccinated, I think more and more we're going to see people say, yeah, I think that's the thing to do. And to me, it's part of being a good neighbor. I mean, I wouldn't want you as my neighbor to give me a dangerous disease, and I wouldn't want to give you a dangerous disease. So love your neighbor, get the vaccine.
Let's talk about national security. We're speaking a few days before the 20th anniversary of 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington. What do you recall about that day?
Well, I was having breakfast in the Pentagon that morning of 9/11. There were a handful of members of the House having breakfast with Secretary Donald Rumsfeld in the Pentagon from 8 to 9. As I was leaving the building, a guard told me that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center in New York. And about that time, we learned on our phones that a second plane had hit. So when I left the Pentagon, I knew there was a terrorist attack in New York. It didn't occur to me that the building I was leaving and the building I was headed toward, the Capitol, were both going to be targets. And so it was about 20 minutes later that plane crashed into the Pentagon. And as As fate would have it, it crashed into the other side of the Pentagon, from the one where I was. I think if they had known where Secretary Rumsfeld's suite was, they would probably crashed in there. But it's a vivid memory to most Americans, and I sent my staff home, and then I went back to my little condo, and at some point they called us back in to give us a briefing, and then we met on the steps, and that's when the footage is of House and Senate members singing "God Bless America" just spontaneously. Somebody broke out in song, and we all joined in singing "God Bless America." But we have had 20 years now where we have not had terrorist attacks. And so my hat is off to all the troops, American and NATO troops and our allies who have taken deployments. Our son was deployed to Afghanistan as an Air Force member. And our hat is off to all of them. I think our administration has made a grave mistake in making the decision that they made not to leave 3,000 or 4,000 NATO troops there to keep the peace, but also the way we backed out, the way we surprised our allies, the way we left Bagram Air Base in the middle of the night without telling our allies. They showed up the next morning and the Americans were gone. That's no way to treat an ally. And so I think it amounts to a foreign policy disaster that neither you nor I have seen in our lifetimes. And we'll be years and decades recovering from the stain that this has done to our credibility internationally.
So you believe we should never have left Afghanistan?
I believe we've stayed in South Korea since the Korean War. And again, my son served in South Korea. We've been in Japan since World War II. And again, my son served in Japan. We haven't had casualties there. We had very few casualties in Afghanistan since 2014, when we turned over the combat to the Afghan army and we provided the intelligence, which is what my son did, and the close air support. That's basically what we were doing. But we had not had an injury or a fatality in Afghanistan since early 2020. And so I think the advice, and reasonable minds can differ on this, no question about it, but the advice of the generals that keeping a 3,000 or 4,000 force of NATO troops there to keep a lid on it would have been much better, and I think it would have prevented the Taliban from taking over the country. We've been sending a signal for 3 or 4 years now that we were just eager to get out of there. And if you send that signal, of course the Taliban is going to be emboldened. So I think we made the wrong decisions. But if you're going to leave, as some of my friends think we should have, you don't leave people in a lurch and turn your back on them.
Why were the American people wanting to get out? Why was the feeling for American people? Because American people felt that we lost the war, it's time to come home.
No, we had won the war. And
but that's been the messaging.
That's true. Well, if you hear steadily from 3 straight administrations that we're bogged down in a war, it molds public opinion. We weren't bogged down in a war. We were in a peacekeeping operation. The Afghan soldiers were sacrificing their health and life and safety, and we were providing them close air support and intelligence. We were not bogged down in a war. We were protecting our interest that is still there to keep the terrorists out of that area, to keep them from mounting an attack on the United States from that territory. And this operation had been a success for 20 years. We haven't had a terrorist attack like 9/11 in 20 years. So I think the strategy was correct. And I think the overwhelming number of military leaders, a substantial majority of them were saying, we were keeping a lid on things. And until we could be assured that the Afghans had the ability to provide their own equipment, their own close air support. Yes, I think we made a mistake, and we've spent 10 times more in 2 months than we were spending per year keeping a lid on things. So I think it was the wrong decision.
All right, Senator Roger Wicker.
Thank you. Yeah.
Appreciate you. All right, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. A report by the online magazine Facing South looks at the plight of renters in America, especially in the Deep South. It highlights a particular issue facing millions of our neighbors, namely how to keep a roof over their heads amid the economic upheavals of the COVID-19 pandemic. Rebekah Barber joins us now by Zoom. She is a writer for Facing South and a research associate for the journal's parent firm, the nonprofit Institute for Southern Studies. Rebekah Barber, welcome to Mississippi Insight.
Thank you.
Well, we just saw the U.S. Supreme Court last month tossing out the federal moratorium on evictions. Talk about your findings and how many Americans are impacted by this decision.
Yes. So first of all, I just want to reiterate that especially in the South, people were being, negatively impacted by evictions even before the pandemic. A study by the Eviction Lab actually found that of the 10 large cities with the highest eviction rates, 9 of them were in the South, and all of them had 20% or more Black population. So that just shows kind of some of the disparity. In addition to that, we've seen how this pandemic, you have frontline workers disproportionately in the South, having to go to work. You see that in the South, you have, states that were opening up prematurely. And it has only, these factors have only worsened the eviction crisis. People were struggling before, but especially now during the pandemic, things have only gotten worse. And the South has, of course, been the most hardest hit.
Why do you think the South is seeing the brunt of the problem?
A lot of it goes back to history. I was, listening to a report that On the Media did a little while ago. And what they found is that you could take a map of, the Great Migration and put it over the map of the highest eviction rates, the states with the highest eviction rates, and the contours would almost exactly, match. You see how in the South, like I was saying before, people are deprived of other protections, which, leaves them with, less resources to pay their rent. The South is where a disproportionate amount of people are low-wage workers. They don't have protections on the job. If you're not making a livable wage, you can't pay your rent. So all those things factor in.
The Princeton study you cite in your piece found that Jackson, Mississippi ranked 5th in the nation for eviction rate. And it also found almost 9 renters out of 100 were being evicted in Jackson each year. And that report was from 2016. Do you see any indication that this situation has gotten any better or worse?
Like I said, I believe it's gotten worse. Especially because of the pandemic. Even before the pandemic, research showed that in this country, almost half of Americans didn't have enough in savings in the case of a $400 emergency. And of course, this pandemic has cost Americans much more, than $400. So, people have been having to make their resources stretch. And the moratorium did help a lot of people. I believe one study said it saved up to 1 million people from evictions. But it was a temporary safety net, but it wasn't enough.
The federal government set up the Emergency Rental Assistance Program last year to help deal with this problem. Talk about the barriers that renters are now facing with this initiative and other efforts to ease the crisis.
Yes. So interestingly enough, Over the summer, I actually had the opportunity to intern at an organization where I was helping people to apply for rental assistance. So I was able to see firsthand some of the barriers that people encounter. One of them is, for various reasons, some landlords are refusing to accept emergency rental assistance funds, even though, the money is right there for that purpose. In addition to that, I found that southern states have been very slow in distributing the funds. I believe it was out of the 13 southern states, I found that as of last month, as of August, 9 states have distributed less than 10%. So even people who have been, doing what they can to apply for these emergency rental assistance funds, they've been the government has been slow to distribute it. And so they face these additional barriers.
Rebekah Barber, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, and we'll be right back. Thanks to Facing South's Rebekah Barber and U.S. Senator Roger Wicker for joining us this week. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown from all of us here at 12 News. Make it a great weekend.